When a wealthy young sponsor mocked a construction worker for not knowing how to talk, the crowd laughed until a quiet volunteer in dusty jeans lifted a beam beside the worker. No one realized it was Keanu Reeves. What he said next didn't just silence the room, it changed a man's life forever. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The sun had barely risen over the quiet valley of Bakersfield, California, but the small construction site was already alive with sound. Hammers struck in rhythm, saws whined against boards, and laughter from volunteers echoed across the open field. The smell of sawdust hung thick in the air, mixing with the earthy scent of fresh concrete. This was the start of a new housing project, one built for families who had lost their homes in the fires the year before. Among the group of volunteers, one man moved with quiet purpose. His plain gray t-shirt was streaked with dust, his hands gloved but steady as he carried long planks of wood across the site. Few paid him much attention. To them, he was just another helper, a man who seemed oddly comfortable, blending in, working harder than most, and rarely speaking. But behind the dark sunglasses and the calm expression was someone they'd never expect to find on a job like this. Keanu Reeves. He hadn't told anyone who he was. The project was organized through a local housing charity, and he'd signed up under a simple name, K. Reeves, just another volunteer trying to help rebuild what was lost. For Keanu, anonymity wasn't a disguise. It was freedom. He wanted to feel the work, the rhythm of teamwork, and the satisfaction that came from effort without applause. By mid-morning, the sun climbed high, and the energy on the site began to shift. Trucks rolled in, carrying supplies. A group of donors arrived, dressed more for photo ops than labor. Among them was a tall young man in his late 20s named Ethan Carlisle. His boots were spotless, his sunglasses expensive, and his smile calculated. Ethan was the kind of sponsor who liked to be seen helping, even if he never picked up a hammer. When Lydia Hartsfield, the charity organizer, introduced him to the workers, Ethan flashed a grin. "Pleasure to meet the heroes making this happen," he said, voice dripping with confidence. Miguel Santos, a quiet middle-aged man with tan skin and a strong build, nodded humbly and extended his hand. "Glad to meet you, sir," he said in halting English. Ethan looked at the hand for a moment too long, then shook it half-heartedly, glancing over Miguel's shoulder at the camera crew setting up nearby. A few minutes later, as Miguel struggled to follow the English instructions on a blueprint, Ethan chuckled under his breath. "Maybe stick to the hammer, buddy," he said, loud enough for others to hear. The laughter that followed was sharp, cutting through the sound of construction. Miguel froze, eyes dropping to the dirt. He didn't argue. He just nodded slowly, pressing his lips together as if to swallow the embarrassment. Keanu was only a few feet away, helping another volunteer secure a wall frame. He heard every word. His hammer paused mid-swing, the quiet rage behind his stillness almost invisible. The other volunteers kept working, pretending not to notice. But Keanu's eyes lifted toward Ethan. The air around him seemed to thicken a calm before something powerful, something human. He didn't say anything yet. Instead, he walked over to Miguel, bent down to check the level on the wood beam, and asked softly, "You mind if I give you a hand?" Miguel hesitated, glancing at the stranger's kind eyes. "Sure," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Keanu took one side of the board and steadied it. Together, they lifted it into place, their movements smooth and silent. The mockery faded into the background. Only the rhythm of work remained. When the beam was secured, Keanu turned slightly, his gaze passing over Ethan. His face was unreadable, but his voice carried weight when he finally spoke. "You mind passing that level?" The words were calm, almost casual, but something in his tone made Ethan pause. He blinked, confused, then slowly handed over the tool. The tension hung there, unspoken yet undeniable, between two men who saw the world in very different ways. The morning wind picked up, carrying dust across the site. Keanu wiped his forehead, the sunlight glinting off the sweat on his brow. Around him, the volunteers returned to work, pretending nothing had happened. but everyone had felt the shift. Something had changed in the air. A quiet confrontation that didn't need shouting or spectacle. Keanu went back to work beside Miguel, and for the first time that day, the older man smiled. It was small, almost shy, but it carried gratitude, deeper than words. And though Ethan tried to shrug it off, he couldn't shake the feeling that something about that moment, something about that man was going to stay with him far longer than he expected. The heat pressed harder as noon approached, and sweat glistened on every brow. Keanu and Miguel worked in silence, their movements in sync, as though they had been building houses together for years. Each nail driven in seemed to erase a bit of the sting Miguel had felt moments earlier. Ethan watched from a few yards away, trying to mask his discomfort. He had expected the celebrity guest, if he even showed up, to stand by the cameras, smile for photos, and leave. Instead, Keanu was there, shoulder to shoulder with laborers, covered in dust and grime, laughing softly when the wind blew sawdust in his hair. There was no performance, no attention-seeking gesture, just genuine effort. Lydia called for a short break, and the volunteers gathered near the water station. Miguel hesitated, wiping his hands nervously before approaching. Keanu handed him a paper cup. "You're good with your hands," Keanu said. Miguel smiled faintly. "I learned from my father. He built everything by hand. I just try to do same." Ethan approached, still holding his phone. "So, this your first time volunteering?" he asked Keanu casually. "Not really," Keanu replied, sipping water. "Just feels good to build something real." Something in his tone made Ethan look closer, but he still didn't recognize him. Not the star from films, not the millionaire, just a man who meant what he said. The authenticity unsettled him. Behind them, Miguel adjusted a crooked frame and hummed an old Spanish tune. Keanu joined in, tapping the rhythm on the wooden beam. The laughter that followed wasn't forced, it was the laughter of equals. The kind that rebuilt not just homes, but dignity. Ethan stood silent, unsure why the scene before him felt heavier than any speech about charity he'd ever given. The lunch whistle blew, and most of the volunteers scattered toward the shaded tents for catered meals. The donors followed, their laughter echoing as they joked about hard work being good for the soul once a year. Miguel stayed behind, sitting on an overturned bucket beneath the frame of a half-built wall. He unwrapped a burrito from foil, its aroma faint but comforting. Keanu joined him without a word. He sat cross-legged on the dusty ground, resting his back against a pile of lumber. Miguel hesitated before breaking his meal in half. "You hungry?" he asked quietly. Keanu smiled, accepting the smaller piece. "Best lunch I've had in a while," he said sincerely. Across the site, Ethan stood by the catering table, holding a plate of grilled chicken and salad, yet unable to eat. Something about watching the two men sharing a simple meal under the sun, covered in sweat, dust, and laughter, made his chest tighten. He had come to feel important, but somehow he felt small. Lydia's voice called out again for photos. "Ethan, we're taking sponsor shots by the main frame." He looked up sharply, smoothing his hair, forcing a grin. He walked toward them, trying to recapture the part he knew best, the successful donor. Cameras clicked as he lifted a paintbrush for the shot, careful not to smudge his designer watch. When he turned around, Keanu was behind him, holding a wooden beam steady while Miguel drilled it into place. Their teamwork drew quiet admiration from the nearby volunteers. Ethan couldn't look away. Keanu caught his gaze briefly, nodded once, then returned to his task. As the day wound down, the sunlight softened into gold, and the house began to take shape. The first walls stood tall, shadows stretching long across the dirt. Miguel ran a hand along the smooth edge of a beam, his eyes proud. Keanu placed a level on top and smiled. "Perfect," he said. Ethan stood a few yards away, hands in his pockets, watching in silence. He didn't know it yet, but that single word, perfect, would haunt him later that night. Because deep down, he'd realize he'd spent his whole life chasing perfection in all the wrong places. The afternoon sun beat down on the construction site, and the heat shimmered off the fresh cement. By now, the volunteers' shirts were soaked through, their energy slowly fading. Still, Miguel worked tirelessly, carrying planks, adjusting angles, and measuring lines with quiet precision. His movements were slow but sure, the kind that came from decades of experience. Ethan stood near the supply truck with two of his friends, other young sponsors, who had shown up to make an appearance. Their laughter rose above the noise of drills and saws. Ethan pointed toward Miguel, who was crouched low, trying to align a board against the base of a wall. "Look at him, man," he said with a smirk. 5 minutes to line up one piece of wood? We're never finishing this thing at that speed." His friends laughed, one of them adding, "Maybe he's still translating the instructions." The others chuckled, emboldened by Ethan's confidence. Miguel straightened slowly, his back stiff from hours of bending. "I'm just making sure it's straight," he said in accented English. His voice was steady, but the shame in his eyes gave him away. Ethan shrugged, not letting the moment go. Sure, but we hired contractors for that. You don't have to overthink it, amigo." Miguel looked down at the dirt. "I'm not overthinking. I've been building houses since I was 15. I just want it done right." Ethan rolled his eyes. "Save it. We've got pros for that," he said, chuckling. The words hung in the air, heavier than the heat. The volunteers nearby paused for a split second, their hammers slowing. It wasn't the first time someone had mocked a worker on a job site, but it never stopped stinging. From across the structure, Keanu set down the lumber he was carrying. He'd been quiet most of the day, working steadily without drawing attention to himself. But something in Miguel's slumped shoulders made him move. He crossed the dusty ground, his boots leaving prints between the stacks of plywood. When he reached Miguel, he didn't say anything at first. He just bent down beside him, checked the alignment, and lifted the beam. "You mind giving me a hand?" he asked casually. Miguel looked up, startled. "Oh, sure," he replied. He grabbed the other end of the beam, and together they raised it into place. Ethan's friends watched, curious. "Who's that guy?" one whispered. "He's been here all morning." Ethan squinted, noticing the quiet volunteer more closely for the first time. The face was familiar, but he couldn't place it until Keanu turned slightly in the sunlight, removing his sunglasses to check the level on the wood. The recognition hit him like a brick. His smirk vanished. "Wait," he muttered. "Is that?" Keanu looked up, meeting Ethan's eyes. "He is a pro," Keanu said softly, nodding toward Miguel. The tone wasn't angry. It was calm, almost gentle, but there was something in it that made everyone stop. The laughter died instantly. The only sound left was the wind brushing through the scaffolding. Keanu turned back to Miguel. "You mind passing that level?" he asked. Miguel handed it over without hesitation, unaware of the small shockwave the moment had sent through the group. Ethan stood frozen, unsure whether to speak or pretend he hadn't heard. His confidence had cracked, but his pride wouldn't let him admit it yet. The silence stretched. Then Keanu began to work again, his movements deliberate, patient, steady, and somehow that quiet steadiness said more than a lecture ever could. Ethan's friends shifted uneasily, exchanging awkward glances. The moment of laughter that had once made them feel superior now felt cheap, exposed beneath Keanu's quiet conviction. They tried to change the subject, muttering something about the heat, but the damage was already done. The tone on the site had changed. Keanu lifted another plank and steadied it against the wall. Miguel climbed a small ladder beside him, adjusting the placement. "Right there," Keanu said softly, tapping the side. Miguel nailed it in, the sound of each strike echoing sharp and sure. Around them, the rhythm of work picked up again, but the volunteers' chatter grew more respectful. Ethan crossed his arms, watching. His throat tightened with something he didn't recognize, shame mixed with discomfort. He had grown up around wealth, around people who believed money was the ultimate proof of worth. His father always said, "Don't get your hands dirty when you can pay someone else to do it." That had been Ethan's world. Until now, Keanu's simple presence disrupted all of it. There was nothing performative about him. No arrogance, no pretense. He just worked sweating, lifting, and laughing softly whenever something went wrong. At one point, Miguel dropped a tool, and Keanu bent to pick it up first. "We all have those days," he said, smiling. Miguel chuckled, a little more at ease now. Ethan felt a pang in his chest, something unfamiliar but strangely grounding. He had come expecting to impress. Yet, it was a man in dusty jeans and worn gloves who held everyone's respect. A gust of wind sent dust swirling around them. Keanu shielded his eyes and called out to a younger volunteer who was struggling with a sheet of plywood. "Need help?" The young man nodded gratefully. Keanu jogged over and lifted one end, his strength surprising for someone his age. Together they carried it to the frame, aligning it perfectly with Miguel's beam. Ethan's friend whispered, "You think he's doing this for publicity?" Ethan didn't answer. The question itself felt wrong. Keanu wasn't surrounded by cameras, and there were no press crews waiting for interviews. He was just here, present. The more Ethan watched, the more something inside him shifted. Miguel wiped his forehead with the back of his hand and looked toward Ethan hesitantly. "You want to try, sir?" he asked, gesturing toward a hammer lying nearby. Ethan hesitated, caught off guard. The suggestion felt beneath him, but Keanu looked over his shoulder at the same moment, nodding slightly. "Go ahead," he said. "You'll be surprised how good it feels." Ethan walked forward, awkwardly picking up the hammer. The handle was rough, heavier than he expected. Miguel steadied a nail for him. "Right here," he said gently. Ethan swung and missed the head completely, earning a soft chuckle from Miguel. Keanu grinned. "Not bad for a first try." Ethan laughed weakly. His pride burned, but strangely, so did his curiosity. For the first time in years, he wasn't the one teaching or leading. He was learning, and from the very man he had just belittled. Ethan stood back, examining the crooked nail he had just driven halfway in. It leaned to the left, mocking him in its own small way. He tried to hide his embarrassment, but Keanu noticed. Without a word, he reached over, pulled the nail free, and offered Ethan another one. "Try again," he said calmly. "This time, let the weight of the hammer do most of the work." Ethan took a deep breath, adjusted his grip, and struck again. The hammer connected cleanly. The sound was solid and satisfying. Miguel smiled. "Better," he said. "See? You have the rhythm now." Keanu gave an approving nod. "Told you, work teaches patience." The comment wasn't sharp or condescending, it was simple, yet it landed with unexpected weight. Ethan found himself nodding slightly, his earlier smirk gone. His friends had drifted away by now, bored and uncomfortable, but Ethan stayed. Something about this quiet group, the smell of sawdust, the rhythm of real work, it stirred something he hadn't felt in years. After a while, Keanu and Miguel lifted another beam into place. Miguel steadied one end while Keanu aligned the other. They worked in seamless cooperation, communicating with short phrases and shared glances. Ethan instinctively stepped forward to help. Without thinking, he grabbed the middle of the beam to balance it. For a brief moment, the three men worked together, the noise of the world fading into silence. When the beam was finally secured, Miguel exhaled deeply and wiped his brow. Keanu stepped back, looking over their work. "That's straight," he said. "Good teamwork." Ethan caught himself smiling. A real one this time. He nodded at Miguel. "You've done this a lot, huh?" Miguel nodded. "All my life. My father built houses in Mexico. I came here when I was 18. Same work, just different Sunday." Ethan listened quietly. His chest tightened again, this time not from discomfort but from realization. He had laughed at a man who had spent decades building homes, while he himself had never built anything lasting in his life. The irony stung. Keanu sensed the shift. "You know," he said gently, "people like Miguel don't just build houses. They build dignity, community, the kind of things you can't put a price on." Ethan's throat felt dry. He wanted to respond, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, He looked at Miguel and simply said, "You make it look easy." Miguel laughed softly. "It's not easy. It's just worth it." As the sun began to lower, casting golden light across the frames of the new homes, Ethan took one last look around. Keanu was already helping another volunteer carry roofing material, his movements fluid, deliberate, selfless. He wasn't the center of attention, and yet, somehow, he centered everyone else. Ethan stood in silence, the earlier arrogance drained from him. For the first time, he realized the difference between working for recognition and working with purpose. And though he didn't yet know it, that quiet lesson, spoken not through words but through action, was about to follow him far beyond that dusty construction site. The midday sun had turned the dirt beneath their boots into a pale shimmer of heat. Most of the volunteers gathered under a large tarp strung between two unfinished walls, grateful for a few minutes of shade. Plastic water jugs sweated in the dust, and the smell of fresh lumber mixed with the faint aroma of food from coolers and lunch bags. Keanu sat quietly among the workers, his back resting against a stack of plywood. He pulled off his gloves, wiped his hands with a rag, and took a long drink from his water bottle. Around him, conversation flowed in English and Spanish, blending into a rhythm of laughter and shared fatigue. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real, and that was exactly what he loved about it. Miguel sat nearby, opening a small lunchbox covered in paint stains. Inside was a single burrito wrapped in foil, still warm from the morning. He unwrapped it carefully, his movements almost reverent, and then looked up at Keanu. "You want half?" he asked. Keanu smiled. "You sure?" Miguel nodded. "I always bring enough to share. My wife says food is better when someone else eats too." Keanu chuckled softly and accepted the half. The burrito was simple beans, rice, a hint of spice, but it tasted better than any catered meal could. He ate slowly, watching as Miguel wiped his hands on his jeans and looked out at the rows of half-built homes. "She wanted to come today," Miguel said suddenly. "My daughter. But she had exams." Keanu tilted his head, listening. "She's in school?" Miguel nodded, pride flickering across his face. "Yeah, civil engineering. Says she's going to design bridges one day." I tell her, "Good. Maybe one day she'll build something her old man can walk across." He smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. Keanu smiled with him. "That's beautiful." Miguel hesitated before continuing, his tone softening. "Her mother's sick. Lupus. We're managing, but the medicine costs more than what I make. Sometimes. So I take extra work, weekends too. People ask why I don't quit, but I like working with my hands. It reminds me I can still give something." Keanu didn't interrupt. He just nodded, his eyes locked on Miguel's. There was no pity there, only respect. "That's real strength," Keanu said finally. "Doing what you can, even when it's hard." Miguel looked down, embarrassed by the compliment. "It's not much, it's everything," Keanu replied. "You're building homes for strangers while fighting your own battles. That's something most people wouldn't understand." Across the tarp, Ethan sat at a folding table near the catering setup, scrolling through his phone. His friends had left for the afternoon, and he looked isolated now, out of place among the sweaty workers and battered coolers. He pretended to read something important, but his eyes kept drifting back to Keanu and Miguel. Watching them share food, watching the easy respect between them, it gnawed at him. Ethan scrolled aimlessly through his phone, pretending to check emails that didn't matter. The laughter under the tarp drifted to him, and he felt strangely left out. He had spent his whole life surrounded by people who admired his money, his connections, his family name, but never his presence. Here, in this dusty lot, respect was earned in a different currency. Sweat, patience, humanity. Keanu leaned back on the plywood stack, listening as Miguel spoke between bites of his burrito. "I started working construction when I was 15, Miguel said. "Back then, we didn't have safety gear, just whatever we could find. My father used to say, 'Don't build something if you wouldn't live in it yourself.'" Keanu nodded, smiling at the wisdom in those words. "That's a good rule." "Yeah," Miguel continued, his eyes distant with memory. "He died on a site in Arizona. Scaffolding gave way. I was there. After that, I promised myself I'd part. Keep building, but safe, slow, careful. No shortcuts. Keanu's voice softened. And you did. Miguel shrugged. Maybe. But I still rent. I still owe. Sometimes I feel like I'm building everyone else's dream except my own. Keanu was silent for a long moment, letting the words hang in the air. The wind rustled through the tarp, carrying the scent of wood and sweat. Maybe, he said finally, you're building something bigger than a dream. Maybe you're building hope. You just can't see it yet. Miguel looked at him, puzzled, then smiled faintly. You sound like a preacher. Keanu laughed softly. Nah, just someone who's made enough mistakes to appreciate people who don't give up. Nearby, Ethan dropped his phone onto the table, unable to focus anymore. He looked toward the two men again. Miguel's hands moved as he talked, strong, scarred hands that had built things his entire life. And beside him sat one of the most famous men in the world, eating out of foil and listening like a lifelong friend. For a moment, Ethan felt a sharp sting of envy, not for fame or success, but for the simplicity of connection. He realized how long it had been since someone had talked to him without expecting something in return. Lydia, the project coordinator, approached with a clipboard. Keanu, she said, smiling. We have catered lunch if you'd like to join the sponsor's tent. Keanu glanced up. I'm good here, he said. She hesitated. You sure? It's air-conditioned. He gestured to Miguel. I'd rather hear more about his daughter's bridges. Lydia blinked, then smiled faintly and walked off. Ethan stared down at his untouched meal. For the first time in his life, the catered plate in front of him looked empty. Miguel leaned back, the foil from his lunch now folded neatly beside him. She's the reason I keep going, he said. Every nail I hammer, I think about her future. I tell her, don't just build houses, mija, build something people can feel safe in. Keanu listened quietly, elbows resting on his knees. She's lucky to have you, he said. You've already given her something stronger than walls. You've given her purpose. Miguel looked down at the dirt, smiling shyly. I hope so. I don't have much, but I try to teach her respect. You know, some people see my hands. They think they're dirty, but these hands, they fed my family. Keanu nodded slowly, the weight of that truth lingering between them. There's nothing dirty about honest work, he said. You're not just building homes. You're reminding people what effort looks like. Ethan's chest tightened as he watched from a distance. He could hear fragments of their conversation carried by the wind, the sincerity of it cutting through the chatter of the sponsors. Every word hit differently, because it was the kind of talk he'd never had in his own world. His conversations were always about deals, image, or influence, never about struggle or dignity. A volunteer passed by, offering cold sodas from a cooler. Keanu waved him over and grabbed two. Here, he said, tossing one gently to Ethan. The bottle thudded on the table beside him. Ethan startled slightly, then looked up. Keanu raised his own drink in a quiet salute before returning to the crew. For a few seconds, Ethan sat frozen. No cameras, no audience, just a gesture, simple, uncalculated, genuine. He picked up the soda and turned it in his hand. It wasn't about the drink, it was about being seen. Under the tarp, Miguel and Keanu continued talking. Miguel's voice carried a kind of humble poetry. People forget that someone built the walls around them, he said. They think homes just happen. But every nail, every cut, every bruise, it all means something. Keanu nodded. You're right. Most people never notice the ones holding the world together. Miguel chuckled softly. That's okay. I notice. And maybe that's enough. Ethan finally stood, walking a few hesitant steps toward them. He didn't speak. He just stood near the shade, listening quietly, unsure if he belonged. Keanu noticed him and gestured to an open spot. Grab a seat, he said. Ethan hesitated, then lowered himself onto an overturned bucket beside them. For the first time that day, he didn't look like a sponsor or a man with influence. He looked human, unsure, curious, humbled. As the break ended and everyone rose to return to work, Ethan stayed still for a moment longer. He looked at his clean hands, then at Miguel's rough, worn palms, and something shifted deep inside him. For the first time in years, he wanted to earn the respect he'd been pretending to have. By late afternoon, the workday was beginning to wind down. The sun tilted low over the California hills, casting long amber shadows across the half-built homes. The hum of power tools faded as volunteers began packing up their gear, exchanging tired smiles and light jokes about sore muscles. Keanu set down his hammer and looked over the progress they'd made. A row of wooden frames now stood tall where there had been only empty dirt that morning. It wasn't finished, not even close, but it already looked like hope. Miguel stood beside him, squinting toward the structures with quiet pride. "Tomorrow, we put up the walls," he said, his voice soft but steady. Before Keanu could answer, a polished black SUV pulled into the dusty lot, its tires crunching over gravel. The door opened, and out stepped Lydia Hartsfield, the project's coordinator. She was a woman in her late 40s, wearing a crisp white blouse and a wide-brimmed hat, her clipboard tucked neatly under one arm. Behind her, a small camera crew followed, adjusting lenses and microphones as they scanned the site. "All right, everyone," Lydia called cheerfully, clapping her hands. "Great progress today. We're getting some shots for the Foundation's social page. So let's gather for a few photos." Ethan perked up instantly, brushing dust from his jacket and fixing his hair in the reflection of a window pane. He signaled one of the photographers. "Let's get one by the frame over there," he said, smiling confidently. Keanu, still unaware of the small spectacle forming, helped Miguel load leftover wood onto a flatbed truck. Lydia approached, gesturing to the cameras. "Keanu, Ethan, could you two stand together for a few quick photos? It'll look great for our sponsors." Keanu turned, slightly uncomfortable with the attention, but nodded politely. Ethan stepped forward quickly, positioning himself right next to him. "Let's show them what teamwork looks like," he said, his grin wide and practiced. He rested a hand on Keanu's shoulder, angling toward the camera with the ease of someone used to being in the spotlight. The flashes began. Keanu smiled modestly, but his eyes shifted toward Miguel, who stood a few feet away, wiping his hands on a rag. He wasn't smiling for the camera he was just watching, quietly content that the day's work had mattered. Lydia turned to Ethan. "We'll feature you both on the Foundation's page tonight. Oh, and don't forget our charity gala starts at 7. We'd love for all of you to attend." Ethan's grin widened. "Perfect. Keanu, you'll be there, right?" Keanu hesitated, glancing at the unfinished house, then back at Miguel. "If Miguel can come too," he said evenly. "Maybe I will." The air around them seemed to pause. Lydia blinked, caught off guard. "Oh well," she began carefully. "The gala is formal. It's mostly donors, board members, and press." "I don't think," Miguel quickly interrupted, shaking his head. "It's okay, sir. I don't fit that kind of place." Keanu smiled faintly. "Then maybe the place needs to fit you." Lydia stood silent for a beat, her polished demeanor faltering. The camera crew shifted awkwardly, unsure whether to keep filming. Ethan's smile wavered too. The moment felt heavier than it should have, like someone had cracked the surface of a world that preferred to stay polished. Finally, Lydia cleared her throat and forced a polite laugh. "Oh, Keanu, that's sweet. But tonight's event is more of a formal fundraiser. Champagne, tuxedos, you know the type." Keanu nodded slowly. "I know the type." He kept his voice calm, not confrontational, but it carried something beneath it, something unshakable. Maybe that's why it could use someone like Miguel there. Miguel's eyes widened. No, he said quickly. "Please, Mr. Reeves, you don't have to do that. I wouldn't know what to say in a place like that." Keanu turned to him. "You don't have to say anything. You already built half the story that's going to be told tonight." Ethan looked uneasy, running a hand through his hair. He was used to charity being neat donations, photos, applause. But this felt different. The idea of a man with calloused hands and dusty boots standing next to him at a black tie gala made him strangely nervous. He caught himself and looked away. Lydia smiled thinly. Well, perhaps next time. We'd love to do a builder appreciation event one day. Keanu nodded but said nothing. He went back to loading the last few tools into the truck bed, his movements quiet, controlled. Miguel watched him, unsure whether to feel honored or guilty. He muttered softly, "I don't belong in a place like that." People would stare. Keanu looked over his shoulder. Let them stare. Maybe they'll finally see something real. That single line seemed to freeze Ethan in place. It wasn't a challenge, it was truth, spoken with the simplicity of someone who didn't care about approval. The photographer, unsure how to recover, called out, "How? About one more picture before we wrap?" Ethan straightened immediately, eager to regain his footing. "Sure, one with the sponsors." He gestured toward the tent, where a few donors were gathered with bottled water and branded hats. "Come on, Keanu, let's get you in a good one." Keanu hesitated, then smiled politely. "You go ahead. I'm fine right here." He turned back to Miguel and helped him cover the lumber pile with a tarp before the evening breeze picked up. The photographers snapped their last few shots of Ethan laughing with donors, his smile practiced but strained. Meanwhile, Keanu and Miguel stood by the half-built house, watching the light turn orange against the wooden beams. Ethan kept glancing toward them, a strange unease tightening in his stomach. For the first time, he wasn't sure which photo told the real story, the one under the gala tent or the one the cameras weren't taking at all. The sky deepened into amber and rose, and the noise around the site began to fade. One by one, the volunteers climbed into their cars and trucks, waving goodbye as they left the dusty field behind. The last hum of a generator died down, leaving only the sound of crickets in the tall grass. Miguel tied down the final tarp while Keanu helped secure the ladders onto the trailer. The two worked in easy rhythm, as if they had been building together for years. Ethan lingered near his SUV, watching them. He wanted to say something, but couldn't find the words. Every time he tried to speak, he was reminded of how he had laughed earlier, how quick he'd been to judge. His confidence from the morning had drained away, leaving behind a strange mix of regret and admiration. Lydia approached Keanu one last time, still smiling for the sake of professionalism. "We'll send the gala details to your email," she said. "There's a red carpet entrance at 7, dinner at 8, and we'll be announcing the top donors right after." Keanu wiped his hands on his jeans. "That's kind of you, Lydia," he said, "but I meant what I said earlier. If Miguel isn't welcome, then neither am I." Her smile faltered again. "Oh, Keanu, it's not about that. We just..." He cut her off gently. "I know, it's about image. But if we're building homes for everyone, maybe we should start by building a room for everyone at the table, too." Lydia hesitated. For a moment, she looked like she might argue, but something in his tone stopped her. She nodded politely and turned toward her car, leaving the words to hang in the cooling air. Miguel shook his head, clearly uncomfortable. "Please, Mr. Reeves, don't make trouble for me. I'm happy right here. I don't belong with people like that." Keanu smiled faintly. "You belong wherever there's honesty. And if they can't see that, maybe they're the ones who don't belong." Miguel laughed softly, trying to hide how deeply the words touched him. "You talk like a movie," he said. "Maybe, but movies only work when they show the truth." As the last rays of sunlight stretched across the wooden frames, Ethan finally walked over, still in his pressed shirt and polished shoes. He stopped beside them, hands in his pockets. "You're really not going?" he asked. Keanu looked up from tightening a rope. "I'll go if he does," he said simply, nodding toward Miguel. Ethan's gaze shifted to Miguel, who looked down awkwardly, clearly unsure what to do. "That gala, it's a big deal," Ethan said quietly. "You'd surprise a lot of people." Miguel smiled humbly. "I already had my big moment today. I built something that'll last." Keanu met Ethan's eyes. Exactly. The three stood there in silence, the unfinished homes behind them glowing gold in the fading light. For the first time that day, Ethan didn't feel like a sponsor or a guest of honor. He felt small, but in the best way, like someone standing at the beginning of something better. The sky had turned a deep orange by the time the last car rolled out of the dusty construction lot. Only 2 trucks remained, one belonging to Miguel, the other to the volunteer coordinator. The wind carried the faint hum of crickets and the smell of sawdust as Keanu helped stack the remaining tools near the bed of Miguel's truck. Miguel tightened the straps around a bundle of wooden planks, his hands moving automatically, more from habit than energy. His shoulders slumped slightly under the weight of exhaustion. Keanu handed him a bucket of nails. "You don't have to stay this late," Miguel said. "You've done enough for one day." Keanu shook his head. "I don't mind. Besides, I don't like leaving work half done." Miguel smiled faintly. "You sound like my father." "Was he a builder too?" Keanu asked, tossing a stray hammer into the toolbox. Miguel nodded. "Yeah. He used to say, 'A man's hands are his resume.'" He laughed softly. "Guess mine have said too much already." Keanu looked down at Miguel's rough palms, streaked with lines of old cuts and calluses. "They say you work hard," he replied. Miguel leaned against the side of the truck and looked toward the setting Sunday. His eyes were tired but kind. "Sometimes I feel like no one sees us unless we make a mistake," he said quietly. "You know, when something breaks or we mess up a deadline, that's when people notice." Keanu stood beside him for a long moment before replying. "I see you." Miguel blinked, caught off guard by the simplicity of the statement. There was no pity in it, only sincerity. He hesitated, then spoke softly. "You know that accident I told you about? The one with the scaffolding?" Keanu nodded. "It wasn't my father," Miguel said. "It was me, 3 years ago. A wall collapsed at a site in Fresno. No one died, thank God, but I broke my leg bad. Couldn't work for months. Lost my job. Lost the apartment too." Keanu's expression tightened. "You lost your home because of that?" Miguel shrugged. "Didn't have much saved. My wife tried to keep things together, but her health got worse. I started sleeping in my truck so my daughter could stay with a friend and finish high school. I told her it was temporary, but it's been 2 years." The words hit Keanu hard. He looked at the man beside him not as a worker, but as a father who had sacrificed everything for his family. "You build homes for others," Keanu said quietly, "while sleeping in your truck. That's not right." Miguel gave a small, weary smile. "It's okay. I've got a roof, 4 wheels, and hope. Sometimes that's enough." Keanu didn't respond right away. He just reached into the cooler and handed Miguel a cold bottle of water. The gesture said more than words could. Miguel twisted open the bottle and took a long sip, staring out at the dimming horizon. The golden light touched the half-built houses, turning the raw wood to amber. "You ever notice," he said quietly, "how beautiful these places look before the walls go up? Like the world's still open. You can see everything." Keanu followed his gaze. "Yeah, like a promise waiting to be finished." Miguel smiled faintly. "Exactly. That's how I look at my life. Just a frame for something better. I just have to keep building." Keanu nodded, the weight of the words settling in his chest. The 2 men stood in silence for a moment, the wind lifting small spirals of dust around their boots. Keanu leaned against the truck, arms crossed, his eyes tracing the edges of the project they had worked on all day. "Does your daughter know?" Keanu asked quietly. Miguel's face softened. "Not really. I tell her I'm staying with a buddy from work. I don't want her worrying while she's in college. She's the first in our family to go. She's studying hard. I send her pictures of the houses I build, tell her I'm fine. She believes it." Keanu exhaled slowly. "You've carried a lot on your own." Miguel shrugged. "It's what dads do, right? We hold things up until they can stand on their own, even if we're falling apart underneath." The honesty in that line pierced Keanu more deeply than he expected. It reminded him of his own quiet years of loss, nights on floors, years of struggle no one saw. "You're a good man, Miguel," he said softly. "You deserve better than sleeping in a truck." Miguel laughed quietly, though it sounded tired. "You'd be surprised what you can get used to. You park under the right streetlight, find a safe spot behind the hardware store, and keep your head down. I'm not ashamed of it." Just wish it wasn't this way. Keanu tilted his head. You shouldn't have to hide. Miguel looked at him, the faintest glint of moisture in his eyes. The world moves fast, my friend. No one waits for the man who fell behind. Keanu reached for a scrap piece of wood and picked up a pencil from the toolbox. He wrote something on it, careful, deliberate lines, and then handed it to Miguel. On the small wooden plank were 4 words: "You are not invisible." Miguel stared at the writing, his throat tightening. You really believe that? Keanu's voice was steady. I do. Because if the world can't see men like you, then it's the world that's blind. For the first time that evening, Miguel didn't look down when he smiled. He stood a little straighter, the piece of wood clutched in his calloused hands, like a quiet reminder that someone finally understood. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The hum of the nearby highway faded into the background, and only the sound of birds returning to their nests filled the silence. Keanu leaned against the side of the truck, watching Miguel run his thumb along the edge of the small wooden plank. The 4 words seemed to anchor him somehow, grounding him in a way that nothing else had in years. Finally, Miguel broke the silence. You know what's funny? When I was a kid, I thought hard work would solve everything. You work enough hours, keep your head down, stay honest, and life rewards you. Keanu looked at him gently. And now? Miguel gave a sad smile. Now I think hard work keeps you alive. But kindness, that's what makes life worth living. Keanu nodded slowly, his voice quiet. You're right. Miguel exhaled, the fatigue in his body visible in every movement. Most people just see the dirt on my boots or the holes in my gloves, but they don't see the hours I spend thinking about the people who'll move into these houses. I always wonder what kind of life they'll have here, if they'll be happy, if their kids will grow up safe. Keanu turned toward the glowing frames of the new homes. They will, he said softly, because people like you built them. Miguel's eyes glistened. You talk like that, and I almost believe it. Keanu smiled. You should. You've already changed lives without even knowing it. They finished loading the last of the materials into the truck. When Miguel closed the tailgate, Keanu noticed an old blanket spread across the back seat. A few personal items sat neatly beside it. An old coffee mug, a worn-out Bible, and a small framed photo of a young girl in a graduation cap. Keanu's chest tightened. That your daughter? Miguel nodded, pride flickering across his face. Yeah, she just finished her first semester. She doesn't know this truck's more home than vehicle. Keanu's voice softened. She will one day, and when she does, she'll realize what strength looks like. Miguel smiled faintly. Maybe, but I hope she never has to know the price of it. Keanu didn't answer. He opened the cooler, pulled out one last bottle of water, and handed it to Miguel. For the road, he said. Miguel accepted it with a grateful nod. You're a good man, Mr. Reeves. Keanu smiled lightly. Just a man who sees another one. As Miguel climbed into his truck and started the engine, Keanu stood beside the unfinished house, watching the taillights disappear down the dirt road. The night air cooled, but something inside him burned with quiet resolve. He knew this wasn't the last time their paths would cross. Because some people build houses, and others build moments that stay standing long after the walls go up. The following evening, the sound of violins floated through the grand ballroom of the Glendale Civic Center. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen fireworks above rows of elegantly dressed donors, their reflections shimmering across marble floors. Waiters in black vests moved between tables, carrying trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. The event was meant to celebrate the year's charity achievements, a night of recognition, networking, and praise. Ethan arrived early, his tuxedo tailored perfectly, his cufflinks gleaming under the golden light. Every handshake felt like a performance, every smile rehearsed. He greeted fellow sponsors, board members, and media figures, his voice polished and pleasant. Yet underneath the charm, his thoughts drifted uneasily to the construction site, to dusty boots and honest laughter that had followed him home the night before. Still, he pushed those memories aside. Tonight was about appearance, reputation, the kind of charity people could photograph. Lydia Hartsfield, radiant in a silver gown, approached him with a welcoming smile. "Ethan, you made it," she said, adjusting the clipboard in her hand. "You're seated at table 2 with the major donors. We're announcing top contributors later, and I have a feeling you'll enjoy the surprise guest." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Surprise guest?" Lydia grinned. "Oh, just someone who's been helping on site lately, but I won't spoil it." He nodded politely, pretending not to care, but curiosity flickered in his chest. He had a feeling he knew who she meant. As the orchestra swelled, Lydia stepped onto the small stage at the front of the room. Her microphone caught the light as she began her opening speech, thanking each sponsor for their generosity. Applause followed, polite and rhythmic. "And tonight," she announced, "we have a very special guest joining us, a man who's been quietly lending his time and hands to this cause. Please welcome Mr. Keanu Reeves." A ripple of excitement swept through the crowd. Whispers rose like a tide. "Keanu Reeves? He's here? Where?" Heads turned toward the entrance as the doors opened. But when Keanu walked in, the room fell into an uneasy silence. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo. He wasn't even wearing a jacket. He came in the same faded jeans and gray t-shirt he'd worn on the construction site, his boots still scuffed with dust. The contrast against the polished crowd was striking. Yet he didn't look out of place. He looked grounded, calm, utterly unbothered by the opulence around him. And beside him, just a step behind, was Miguel. He wore his cleanest shirt, neatly ironed, though the fabric was old. A borrowed tie hung loosely at his neck, slightly crooked. His shoes were polished but worn, the kind that had walked miles. He clutched his hands nervously as he followed Keanu into the hall, his eyes wide beneath the bright chandeliers. The murmurs returned, hushed and uncertain. Guests glanced between one another, unsure whether to clap or whisper. The sight of a laborer at such an event was unusual, uncomfortable. But Keanu didn't pause. He placed a steady hand on Miguel's shoulder and walked him straight toward the front table. The atmosphere inside the ballroom changed almost instantly. Conversations softened. The faint clinking of glasses slowed. Every movement seemed to quiet as Keanu and Miguel made their way through the tables. Some guests smiled politely, unsure whether to applaud. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their designer jewelry catching the light as they turned to whisper behind champagne flutes. Keanu walked slowly, but confidently, greeting people with nods and brief handshakes. He didn't seem fazed by the stares or the awkward silence. Miguel, on the other hand, kept his gaze low, gripping his tie as though afraid he'd done something wrong by being there. Lydia quickly descended from the stage, smiling too brightly, her voice a little high. "Keanu, we're so honored you could make it," she said, her tone overly cheerful as she gestured toward the front. "We have a seat right up here for you." Keanu's eyes softened. "Thank you," he said, "but I'd like Miguel to sit beside me." Lydia hesitated for half a heartbeat. It wasn't that there wasn't room. There was. But this was a gala for high-profile donors, people who had given thousands. The workers weren't meant to be part of the photo. Still, she forced a smile. "Of course," she said. "Right this way." Ethan watched from his table, caught between pride and discomfort. On one hand, he was glad Keanu had come. His presence meant great press for the foundation. On the other, seeing Miguel standing there among polished silverware and white linen tablecloths made something inside him twist. It was like two worlds colliding, one that built the houses and one that took credit for them. As Keanu and Miguel sat down, Lydia returned to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "let's welcome one of Hollywood's most respected figures, a true philanthropist and friend to our mission, Mr. Keanu Reeves." Applause broke out, hesitant at first, then stronger as the cameras flashed. But Keanu didn't stand or wave. He just smiled humbly and gestured toward Miguel. "I'm just a volunteer," he said softly. "He's the real builder." The applause faltered slightly, confusion rippling across the room. Lydia smiled, nervously. "Yes, of course," she said quickly, trying to steer the event back to its polished rhythm. "And now, Dinner will be served." As waiters began bringing out plates of salmon and salad, Keanu leaned toward Miguel. "How are you holding up?" he asked quietly. Miguel swallowed, his eyes darting around the room. "It's beautiful," he whispered, "but I don't belong here." Keanu shook his head. "You belong everywhere you've worked for." Miguel looked at him, uncertain. "You really believe that?" Keanu smiled. "I do, and tonight, so will they." At the next table, Ethan listened without meaning to. The words sank deep into him, and he couldn't explain why his throat felt tight. He stared down at his untouched wine glass, realizing this night was not going to unfold the way he expected. Dinner service had begun, but most of the guests seemed more interested in their phones and glances than in the food. The whispers grew louder now that people had adjusted to the surprise. "Why is he here?" one woman murmured to her husband, nodding subtly toward Miguel. "He looks like one of the workers." Her husband shrugged. "Probably a publicity stunt. Reeves always does things like that." Ethan heard it. The words burned his ears. For a moment, he wanted to speak up, to defend Miguel, but his voice caught. Instead, he stared at Keanu across the room. The actor sat quietly, speaking to Miguel like they were old friends. There was no awkwardness, no sense of divide. Just two men talking. Miguel picked at his meal carefully, unsure which fork to use. Keanu noticed and switched his silverware too, quietly matching him. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. Miguel relaxed a little, taking a slow bite. At another table, Lydia's assistant whispered to her, "Should we move them after dinner? Maybe seat Mr. Reeves with the press?" Lydia forced a smile but shook her head. "No, let him be. This is already more authentic than anything we planned." When the first course ended, Lydia returned to the podium. "We're deeply grateful to everyone who supported the Build a Home Foundation," she said. "This year, we've reached over 200 families in need. And much of that comes from the generosity of donors like Ethan Carlisle." Applause filled the room, and Ethan stood automatically, bowing his head modestly. But as he looked toward Keanu and Miguel, the sound felt hollow. He sank back into his chair, his palms slightly sweaty. Then Lydia continued, her smile warming. "But what truly makes this mission possible are the hands that build, the workers and volunteers who give more than time, they give heart." She glanced at Keanu, who nodded subtly. "So, tonight, before we begin the awards, I'd like to acknowledge someone special." The spotlight turned toward Keanu's table. Gasps rippled through the audience as the beam caught Miguel's surprised face. He froze, his fork clattering onto the plate. Lydia's voice softened. "This man has been with us for years. He's built homes, taught new volunteers, and worked twice as hard as anyone here. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Miguel Santos." The room fell silent for a heartbeat. Then a wave of applause broke out. Slow at first, then louder. Miguel's eyes filled as he looked down at his lap, unsure what to do. Keanu stood and clapped first, starting the chain. Ethan rose too, his hands trembling slightly as he joined in. He saw Miguel glance up, caught between shock and disbelief. For the first time, the man everyone had ignored stood under the same light as the donors, and standing beside him was Keanu Reeves, dust still on his boots, smiling like this was the only spotlight that ever mattered. The applause still echoed through the chandeliered hall when Lydia stepped back from the microphone, her voice trembling slightly from emotion. Miguel stood awkwardly beside the table, unsure what to do with the sudden attention. His calloused hands fidgeted with his napkin, and he seemed half ready to sit back down. Keanu leaned toward him and whispered, "You earned this. Take a breath." Miguel nodded, his chest rising and falling with disbelief. Around them, the guests clapped politely, though a few looked uncertain, as if they weren't sure how to feel about a man in work boots being honored among diamond necklaces and designer suits. The applause slowly faded, and conversation resumed uneasy, fragmented. Ethan pushed back his chair, standing with his wine glass in hand. He walked toward Keanu's table, a forced grin on his face. "Didn't expect to see our construction hero here," he said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. His tone carried a mix of sarcasm and strained humor. Guess they'll let anyone in these days. Several guests chuckled softly, more out of discomfort than amusement. The laughter rang hollow in the grand room. Miguel's shoulders stiffened, his face flushing with embarrassment. He looked down at the tablecloth, his jaw tightening. Keanu stayed seated for a moment, finishing his sip of water before standing slowly. His posture was calm, unshaken. His voice was steady, even gentle. "That's right," he said. "They let in the man who builds the very homes this event is celebrating." The air in the room shifted immediately. The light humor in Ethan's expression vanished, replaced by surprise. Keanu gestured toward Miguel, his tone firm but respectful. "Maybe tonight," he continued, "we celebrate the people who do the actual work, the ones whose hands make all of this possible." The first few claps came from a table in the back, then another, and another. Within seconds, applause filled the room. Again, but this time, it carried something different. It wasn't polite or rehearsed. It was real. Miguel looked around, stunned. Lydia clapped too, her eyes glassy. Even the waiters paused, joining in quietly as they passed with trays of dessert. Ethan stood frozen, his grin fading. The spotlight that once followed him now belonged to someone else entirely. His throat tightened, though he tried to hide it behind a forced smirk. "Of course," he said weakly. "We all appreciate the hard work. That's why we're here, right?" Keanu tilted his head slightly. "Are we?" he asked softly. The question wasn't hostile, it was reflective, but it struck harder than any confrontation could have. The room fell silent again, waiting. Ethan's hand trembled slightly as he set his wineglass down. He opened his mouth to speak but couldn't find the words. Keanu didn't press him further. He just looked at Miguel and said quietly, "You belong here as much as anyone." Miguel swallowed hard, his eyes glistening. "Thank you," he whispered. The stillness in the room seemed to stretch forever. No one dared to move or even breathe too loudly. Lydia glanced nervously at the event organizers near the back, silently praying the tension would pass. But Keanu didn't fill the silence with charm or jokes like other celebrities might have. He simply stood there, steady and composed, letting the truth hang heavy in the air. Ethan's face was pale. He tried to recover with a nervous laugh. "Hey, I was just kidding around," he said, raising his hand slightly. "I didn't mean anything by it. It's a gala. We're all here to have a good time." Keanu's gaze didn't waver. "A good time," he repeated softly, almost to himself. Then his voice grew firmer. "Do you know what Miguel was doing while everyone here was planning tonight's speeches and photographs? He was still at the site, fixing beams, hauling supplies, making sure those homes stand long." After we stopped clapping, several people shifted in their seats, the words cutting deeper than anyone expected. Lydia looked down at her notes, unsure whether to intervene. Ethan forced another laugh. "Look, I get it. He's hardworking. That's great. But this event is about raising money, about awareness. The big picture." Keanu's eyes softened, but his tone carried quiet strength. "The big picture," he said. "Isn't that what every worker like Miguel builds? One nail at a time? You can't raise awareness for something you don't understand. You can't fix poverty from behind a curtain," the crowd murmured, a few guests nodding in agreement. Someone clapped softly from the far end of the room, and others followed hesitantly. Miguel shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his head slightly bowed, as though he wanted to disappear and stay all at once. Keanu placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "This man doesn't need our sympathy," he said. "He deserves our respect." Miguel looked up, his eyes meeting Keanu's. He tried to speak, but emotion caught in his throat. He finally managed to whisper, "I just came to work, not to make a scene." Keanu smiled faintly. "You didn't make one. You reminded everyone what this is really about." The applause grew again, stronger this time. The cameras that had been pointed at Ethan and the other sponsors now turned toward Miguel. He blinked, startled by the flashes, but Keanu stayed close beside him, grounding him through the moment. Ethan stood frozen, a glassy look in his eyes. Every bit of confidence he'd worn like armor now felt heavy, hollow. For the first time in his life, He saw how small status looked when placed beside integrity. When the applause faded, Keanu turned toward him. His tone was softer now, almost kind. "It's not too late to build something real," he said. Ethan swallowed hard, nodding once but unable to speak. He lowered his gaze, his reflection shimmering faintly in the polished floor. The room remained silent. No one dared break the fragile honesty that had settled over them. The orchestra in the corner had gone completely quiet, their instruments resting on their laps as the tension eased into a heavy kind of reverence. No one quite knew how to restart the evening. Lydia stepped forward hesitantly, her heels clicking against the marble floor, but Keanu held up a hand gently, his calm voice filling the silence. "Everyone in this room," he said, "has done something good tonight. You've given, you've cared, and that matters. But giving isn't just about writing a check. It's about seeing the people you're helping as equals, not as names on a brochure, not as a photo in a campaign, but as human beings." He turned slightly, gesturing toward Miguel, who sat motionless, his chest rising and falling in slow disbelief. "This man doesn't need charity. He needs recognition. He deserves to be in every story we tell about rebuilding lives." "Because he's been doing it quietly, long before any of us showed up with cameras." The words hung in the air, like the steady echo of a bell. The guests looked at one another, some uncomfortable, others visibly moved. The clinking of utensils had stopped entirely. The glow from the chandeliers shimmered across the tables, and for a brief moment, the gala that had been about luxury became something sacred. Ethan stared at the floor, his mind replaying the day before the mocking laugh, the smug tone, the dismissive gesture. He had spent years believing respect could be bought, only to watch a man earn it in silence. His throat tightened, his palms slick with shame. Finally, he spoke, his voice low but audible. "You're right," he said quietly. "I was wrong." The admission was so unexpected that several people turned in surprise. Keanu met his eyes, saying nothing. Ethan continued, his tone trembling. "I came here thinking this was about my company, about my comp, image. But seeing you here, Miguel, it hit me. You're the reason this matters. Without you, none of this would exist." Miguel looked up, unsure what to say. He shook his head modestly. "I just build what people need," he said. Ethan nodded. "That's more than most of us do." Keanu placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, a gesture of peace rather than triumph. "Acknowledging it is the first step," he said softly. Lydia stepped closer to the microphone again, her voice steadier this time. "I think tonight turned out exactly how it should," she said. "Because maybe this, what we just saw, is the kind of change our charity should be known for." The crowd began to clap again, slowly at first, then louder, fuller, no longer out of politeness but genuine admiration. Some guests rose to their feet, others simply smiled through tears. As the applause swelled, Miguel looked around in disbelief, his eyes shining. He wasn't invisible anymore. For the first time in his life, people saw him not as labor, not as background, but as someone whose worth needed no defense. Keanu glanced at him and whispered, "Told you that you belong here." Miguel smiled through the blur in his eyes. "Maybe for the first time, I believe it." The applause slowly faded into a hush. The ballroom lights softened, and Lydia stepped back toward the podium, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke. "Before we close the evening, I'd like to invite our special guest, Mr. Keanu Reeves, to share a few words." Keanu looked surprised, glancing briefly toward Miguel before standing. The room followed him with expectant eyes as he made his way to the front. Every step seemed to echo against the polished floor. When he reached the microphone, he paused, resting both hands on the podium. He took a quiet breath and scanned the audience, not with the charm of a movie star, but with the humility of a man who'd spent the last few days among workers and dust. "I don't have a speech," he began, his tone calm, grounded. "I wasn't planning to talk tonight." A few soft chuckles rippled through the room, but they faded when his eyes turned toward Miguel. "But I met a man this week who reminded me what real charity looks like. It's not in money or recognition or headlines. It's in sweat, humility, and quiet persistence." The words carried through the hall with a stillness that made people listen differently. Keanu didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His sincerity did the work for him. He gestured slightly toward the table where Miguel sat today. This man has spent 20 years building homes for families he'll never meet. He's lifted walls, carried beams, patched roofs, and worked through pain that most of us will never understand. He's done it without cameras, without applause, and without ever asking for credit. Because for him, it's never been about being seen. It's about making sure someone else can sleep safely under a roof. The audience fell silent. The only sound was the quiet hum of the air conditioning and the faint clinking of glasses as a waiter froze mid-step. Keanu continued, his voice lowering. I've been lucky in life. I've worked on movie sets where hundreds of people make magic happen. And I've learned that what matters most are the ones behind the scenes. The people who hold everything together while the rest of us stand in the light. Miguel is one of those people. He's built hope for strangers while sleeping in the back of his truck between shifts. And still, he shows up every day with gratitude. A quiet gasp escaped from one corner of the room. Several guests exchanged glances, shocked by the revelation. Miguel's hands gripped the edge of the table, his head lowering as if trying to disappear. Keanu noticed, but kept his tone steady. He didn't tell me that for sympathy, Keanu said. He told me because he believes in work that means something. Because, even when life broke him, he kept building for others. Ethan's throat felt dry. The glass in his hand trembled slightly as he set it down. The words hit him harder than he expected. Every line Keanu spoke seemed to mirror the guilt he'd been carrying since that first afternoon. Across the hall, Lydia's eyes glistened. The camera crew had stopped recording. Even the journalists from the charity magazine had lowered their pens. No one wanted to break the moment. Keanu's voice softened even more, almost like he was speaking only to Miguel, though everyone could hear. When I first met him, he told me something I can't forget. He said people only notice workers like him when they make a mistake. But the truth is, every perfect wall, every safe roof, every warm home exists because of hands like his. Miguel shifted uneasily in his chair, his face turned down, emotion tightening his throat. Keanu smiled gently, sensing it. He didn't want to be here tonight, he said, his tone carrying warmth instead of embarrassment. He told me he didn't belong, but I think it's the other way around. If this gala is about what it means to give, then the people who build with their hands and hearts belong here most of all. The line struck something deep in the audience. Even the most jaded donors felt it. It was quiet, too quiet, as if the entire room collectively realized how hollow their applause had sounded before. Keanu looked around the tables, his expression calm but firm. I've met people with money, fame, and influence, he continued, but I've never met anyone richer than the man who gives his time, his strength, and his dignity for the sake of others. Miguel didn't come here asking for praise. He came here because I insisted. And now that he's here, I hope we all remember him every time we talk about generosity. He paused, letting the weight of his words rest in the silence. Then, in a softer voice, almost a whisper, he added, real charity doesn't come from the top down. It comes from the ground up. It starts with those who carry the weight, so others can rise. The room erupted into applause, not the polite kind that usually followed gala speeches, but a long standing ovation. Chairs scraped against the marble floor as one by one people rose to their feet. Miguel looked up in disbelief, his eyes bright with tears he could no longer hide. He tried to stand, but Keanu placed a steadying hand on his shoulder, smiling. Just stay where you are, he said softly. You've earned it. Miguel shook his head, whispering, I don't deserve this. Keanu leaned closer, his voice gentle but firm. You deserve more than this. Ethan stood as well, clapping harder than anyone. His earlier arrogance had vanished completely. He didn't care about appearances or photographs now. For the first time, he was proud of something that wasn't tied to his own name. When the applause finally began to fade, Keanu stepped down from the podium and returned to his seat beside Miguel. The air in the ballroom had changed. The noise of conversation was gone, replaced by quiet reflection. Even the chandeliers seemed to shine softer. And as Miguel sat there, surrounded by people who had once looked past him, he realized that the world hadn't just seen him tonight, it had listened. The thunder of applause eventually faded, leaving the room heavy with a kind of reverent quiet. Miguel sat still, his shoulders hunched as though afraid to move, while people continued to glance at him with newfound respect. Lydia stood at the edge of the stage, her eyes glistening, unable to hide how deeply Keanu's words had affected her. But across the room, Ethan couldn't stay seated. He slipped out through a side door that led to the balcony overlooking the city. Cool night air brushed against his face, carrying the faint hum of traffic below. He leaned against the stone railing, staring at the lights scattered across Los Angeles like fallen stars. His reflection shimmered faintly in the glass of the ballroom doors behind him. He didn't recognize himself anymore. The weight of everything hit him at once. The mocking words he'd thrown at Miguel. The empty pride he'd worn for years. The way Keanu's calm defiance had stripped him of his illusions. He had spent his whole life trying to stand above others, yet at that moment, he had never felt smaller. He rubbed his hands together, the smoothness of his skin a reminder of how untouched his life had been by real struggle. "What have I been doing?" he muttered under his breath. The door creaked open behind him. Ethan turned and saw Keanu step outside, his denim jacket faintly catching the glow of the ballroom lights. He didn't look angry, just tired, calm, and human. He closed the door softly behind him, leaving the noise of the gala muted. Keanu approached and leaned beside him on the railing, looking out at the skyline. For a while, neither spoke. The silence wasn't awkward, it was reflective, the kind of stillness that happens when truth lingers too loud to ignore. "You didn't mean to hurt him, did you?" Keanu asked finally, his tone quiet but direct. Ethan shook his head. "No, I didn't. He exhaled, the words catching. "I grew up believing success meant standing above everyone else. Like if you're not ahead, you're losing." Keanu nodded slowly, eyes still on the horizon. "I know that mindset. The world teaches it early: climb fast, stay visible, measure your worth in applause." He paused. "But the truth is, real success isn't about being above anyone. It's about standing beside them." Ethan turned to look at him, the faintest flicker of confusion crossing his face. "That sounds good," he said quietly. "But I don't even know how to start doing that. It's like it's wired into me to compare, to win, to prove." Keanu looked at him, his voice steady but gentle. "Then maybe start by listening." Ethan frowned slightly. "Listening?" Keanu nodded. "Yeah, not with the intent to reply or defend, just to understand. When you start hearing the people you've overlooked, the world stops revolving around you, and that's where growth begins." Ethan let out a slow breath, the truth settling in his chest like a weight and a relief all at once. He leaned on the railing again, eyes distant. "It's strange," he said softly. "For the first time, I don't know what comes next." Keanu rested his arms on the railing, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "That's okay," he said. "Not knowing what comes next means you're finally paying attention. Most people move through life too fast to notice what really matters." Ethan nodded slowly. "I've been moving fast my whole life. Every deal, every donation, every public moment. It was all about keeping up an image. But tonight, when Miguel stood up there, I felt like I was seeing something I'd forgotten existed." Keanu looked over at him. "Something real." Ethan exhaled, his voice almost breaking. He didn't have anything. No recognition, no comfort, not even a home. And somehow, he still looked richer than I ever have. "I don't understand that." Keanu's lips curved in a faint, knowing smile. "It's because he has purpose. He's building something that outlasts himself. That kind of fulfillment doesn't come from being seen. It comes from doing something that matters, even when no one's watching." Ethan's eyes fell to the ground. "I used to think money could buy that feeling. I've been giving for years, writing checks, cutting ribbons, posing for pictures. But what I gave didn't cost me anything. Not time. Not effort. Not heart. Keanu nodded. Then start giving differently. Give what can't be measured in dollars. Your time, your attention, your respect. Ethan turned to him, his voice low. Do you think people can change? Really change? Keanu took a long breath before answering. I think people remember. Deep down, we all know what's right. Sometimes it just takes a moment, a person, an experience, to wake that up again. Ethan's throat tightened. And Miguel was that for me. Keanu smiled. Then don't let it end here. They stood quietly, the city lights shimmering like scattered embers below. The sound of distant laughter from the gala drifted faintly through the glass doors. Inside, people were beginning to leave, still murmuring about the speech, the worker, the moment that had changed the tone of the entire night. Ethan straightened his jacket, still staring out at the skyline. I don't want to go back in there pretending everything's fine. Keanu placed a hand on his shoulder, his grip steady, reassuring. You don't have to pretend. Just start small. Tomorrow, go back to that site. Not as a donor, but as someone willing to learn. Ethan nodded slowly, the ideas sinking deep into him. I will, he said. I need to. Keanu smiled faintly. Good. Because when you build something with your hands, even for one day, you start to understand what real success feels like. Ethan looked at him, his voice barely above a whisper. Standing beside them, Keanu met his gaze. Exactly. The two men stood in silence again, the wind brushing through the trees below. For the first time in years, Ethan felt something unfamiliar peace. He didn't know where the road ahead would lead, but he finally knew where to start. Inside the ballroom, the atmosphere had softened into something entirely new. The lights glowed warmer now, no longer harsh or dazzling. People spoke quietly, some with tears still in their eyes, others lost in thought. The night that had begun as another polished charity event had become something real, something human. Miguel sat alone at his table, his untouched dessert glistening under the light. He still hadn't recovered from Keanu's speech. His hands trembled slightly as he folded and unfolded the corner of his napkin. Around him, guests gave him small nods and smiles, gestures of respect that felt foreign but deeply moving. He didn't know where to look. Lydia approached gently, her clipboard tucked under her arm. Miguel, she said softly, Mr. Reeves insisted you stay until the end. He wanted you to know tonight, you're our guest of honor. Miguel's eyes widened. Me? No, ma'am. Please. I don't belong up there. I just work with my hands. Lydia smiled warmly. That's exactly why you belong up there. Would you mind saying a few words? He froze. A few words? He shook his head quickly. No. I'm not good at speeches. I barely finished high school. Lydia knelt slightly so her eyes met his. Miguel, every person in this room just heard a story that changed how they see the world. And that story is yours. Don't worry about speeches, just tell the truth. Miguel looked down at the tablecloth, his throat tight. The truth? She nodded. Yes, the truth. He sat there for a moment, thinking about the years he had worked in silence, the long nights in his truck, the calluses that had become part of him. Slowly, he rose from his seat. Lydia gestured for the microphone to be brought to him. The crowd quieted again as Miguel stepped toward the front of the room. He moved hesitantly, his shoulders hunched, unsure where to look among the sea of tuxedos and gowns. When he reached the microphone, he stood still for a long moment, gripping the stand with both hands. The murmur of conversation faded until all that remained was the sound of his shaky breath. I build houses, he began, his accent thick but his words clear. That's what I do, but I never thought I'd be in one like this. The crowd laughed softly, warm laughter that broke the tension and gave him courage. He looked around the room, his eyes shimmering. All my life, I've worked to make sure other people have homes. I never asked for much. I just wanted to do my job and go home at the end of the day. He paused, swallowing hard. But there were times when there wasn't a home to go to. And even then, I kept building. because I knew someone else needed it more. A hush spread across the audience again. Miguel's voice trembled, but didn't break. I didn't come here tonight to be thanked. I came because a man named Keanu told me people needed to see what real work looks like. And now that I'm standing here, I think maybe he was right. Miguel took a slow breath, his hands still trembling slightly as he looked across the room. You know, he said, his voice steadying, I used to feel invisible. People would walk past me, give orders, or complain about the noise, but they never looked me in the eye. I told myself that was fine, that maybe we're meant to stay in the background. But tonight, he paused, his throat tightening again. Tonight, I felt seen. Several people in the audience nodded, some wiping their eyes. Miguel's humility carried more power than any prepared speech could have. He looked down for a moment, then lifted his gaze toward the chandeliers above. My daughter's studying civil engineering, he said proudly. She wants to build bridges. I told her she already has. She built one between me and this moment. A gentle wave of laughter moved through the room. He smiled faintly, emboldened. All I ever wanted was for her to be proud of what I do. I used to worry she'd be ashamed that her father was just a builder. But tonight, I realized something. He straightened, his voice growing firmer. Respect isn't something you wear. It's something you earn. And it doesn't come from money, it comes from what you give. The words lingered in the air like music. Lydia covered her mouth, tears forming in her eyes. Across the ballroom, Ethan quietly re-entered through the glass doors. The sound of the applause that followed Miguel's words reached him as he stepped inside. He paused, watching the man he had once mocked stand in the spotlight with grace and strength. Miguel smiled shyly, clearly overwhelmed by the applause. I don't know how to thank you, he said, his voice breaking slightly. But if there's one thing I hope you remember tonight, it's this. Every house, every wall, every nail has a story. And sometimes, the people who build them carry stories too. The applause swelled again, louder, this time, rising until nearly every person in the ballroom was on their feet. Miguel blinked in disbelief, his chest heaving as he tried to steady his breathing. Lydia clapped the hardest, her tears glistening under the lights. Even the staff in the back had stopped working to watch. And then, from the far end of the room, Ethan began walking toward the stage. He didn't rush, he didn't speak. He just joined in the applause as he approached, his expression open and sincere. When he reached the front, he extended his hand. I was wrong about you, he said quietly. Thank you for reminding me what this is all for. Miguel hesitated, then took his hand firmly. The crowd erupted into cheers once more, their applause filling every corner of the quad. Hall, Keanu, standing at the edge of the room, smiled quietly. He didn't need to say a word. The moment spoke for itself. When the final applause faded and the crowd began to disperse, the ballroom carried the faint scent of candles, champagne, and quiet reflection. The energy had shifted entirely. The usual post-gala chatter about donors, pledges, and photographs was replaced by low, meaningful conversations. People spoke about Miguel's words, about Keanu's message, about dignity and work. It was as though the entire room had exhaled something it didn't realize it was holding in. Miguel stood near the stage, shaking hands with guests who came to thank him. He looked both overwhelmed and deeply moved. For a man who had spent years in silence, the attention felt unreal. His shirt was slightly wrinkled now, his tie still crooked, but to the people surrounding him, he looked more distinguished than anyone in a tuxedo. Ethan lingered near the back of the room, watching quietly. His heart pounded with a strange mix of relief and humility. The walls he had built inside himself for years, walls of pride, arrogance, and distance, had cracked open. And through those cracks, something honest had begun to grow. As the last guests drifted toward the exits, Ethan walked slowly across the floor, weaving between half-empty glasses and folded napkins. Miguel was turning to leave when Ethan called softly, "Miguel." Miguel turned, surprised. "Mr. Carlyle?" Ethan shook his head. "Ethan," he said quickly, Just Ethan. He took a step closer, his voice unsteady but genuine. I was wrong about you. Miguel looked confused for a moment, then smiled faintly. You don't have to say that. I do, Ethan replied. You've taught me more in one day than any business school or leadership class ever did. I used to think the world revolved around people like me, the ones who make decisions, who fund projects, who sit behind desks. But now I see it doesn't move at all without people like you. Miguel's eyes glistened, his smile trembling. We all build something, he said softly. You just needed to see what yours could be. Ethan nodded, his throat tight. You're right, and I don't want tonight to be the end of it. I want to help, but not the way I used to. Miguel tilted his head slightly. What do you mean? I mean, I want to be involved. I want to work beside you, not just write a check. If you'll let me, I'd like to come back to the site. For a moment, Miguel didn't speak. Then he chuckled quietly, his tone kind. You sure you can handle the hammer? Ethan smiled, his eyes wet. Probably not, but I can learn. Miguel extended his hand. Then maybe we both learn something. Ethan took it firmly, gripping the rough, scarred hand of the man he'd once mocked. For the first time, the handshake wasn't about power or presentation. It was a bridge between two worlds that had finally met on even ground. Across the room, Keanu stood near the doors, his arms folded loosely. He didn't approach or interrupt. He just watched, a faint, peaceful smile on his face. Keanu leaned quietly against the doorway, his posture relaxed, eyes following the two men from afar. The moment didn't need his voice. It belonged to them now. Miguel and Ethan stood together near the edge of the stage as the last of the lights dimmed to a soft golden hue. The clatter of cleanup echoed faintly from the catering crew, but the grand hall was mostly empty. For once, there were no photographers, no flashing lights, no applause, only truth. Ethan broke the silence first. I used to come to these events and think the goal was to feel good about giving, he said quietly. But tonight, I realized I'd been giving without really seeing the people I claimed to help. I built a wall between us. Miguel nodded thoughtfully. It's easy to build walls, he said. The hard part is building doors. Ethan smiled faintly, realizing the weight behind the words. You've been opening doors your whole life, haven't you? Miguel chuckled softly. I try to. Every house I build is one. Every wall I raise gives someone a way in. I guess that's my purpose. Ethan looked at him with quiet respect. Then maybe mine should be helping you keep building. Miguel's eyes softened. Then we're already on the same team. They stood in silence again. But this time, it was peaceful. It wasn't the uneasy quiet of guilt or distance. It was the kind that comes when two people understand each other without needing to fill the space with words. Keanu finally walked over, his boots tapping gently against the marble floor. He stopped a few feet away, smiling. Looks like we just finished another kind of construction project, he said lightly. Miguel laughed. One without blueprints. Those are usually the best kind, Keanu replied. Ethan looked at him, his expression sincere. I don't know how you do it, he said. You show up and everything changes. Keanu shook his head. I don't change anything. I just notice what's already there. You two did the real work. He looked between them, the humility in his voice grounding the moment. Sometimes the hardest part of helping people isn't building something new, it's rebuilding how we see each other. Ethan nodded slowly. That's what tonight was. A rebuild. Miguel smiled, his voice quiet but firm. A foundation can always be stronger the second time. Keanu grinned. Exactly. They stood together for a moment longer, the three of them framed by the faint golden glow of the nearly empty hall. The noise outside had faded to distant echoes of cars and laughter. But inside, it was calm, a different kind of silence, one that didn't need to be filled. Finally, Miguel turned toward the door. I should get going, he said. Got an early start tomorrow. Concrete doesn't pour itself. Ethan smiled. Then I'll see you there. Don't be surprised if I show up with a hammer. Miguel chuckled. As long as you bring coffee. Keanu laughed softly, clapping both men on the shoulders. That's the deal. Coffee and honesty. As they stepped out into the cool California night, the three men walked side by side down the marble steps, no longer separated by titles, wealth, or pride. Just equals, carrying the quiet satisfaction that something invisible but lasting had been built. Tonight, the next morning, sunlight spilled across the construction site, like a quiet promise. The air smelled of fresh wood and dust, the kind of scent that carried both fatigue and renewal. A thin mist still hung over the open field, softening the outlines of the half-finished houses. Volunteers moved about with coffee cups and tool belts, their laughter echoing faintly across the lot. Miguel was already there, as always, tightening a line of boards along the side of one of the homes. His old truck sat parked near the edge of the site, the same one that had served as both transport and shelter for so long. He moved with practiced rhythm, steady and calm, his hands sure and unhurried. He didn't notice the black SUV that pulled up beside the dirt road until he heard the door close. When he looked up, his expression broke into surprise. Ethan Carlisle stepped out. No tuxedo, no tailored coat, no polished shoes. Just jeans, a plain gray t-shirt, and a bright orange hard hat that sat slightly crooked on his head. Miguel couldn't help but laugh. "You sure you know how to use that?" Ethan grinned, lifting a hand sheepishly. "Not yet, but I'm trying to learn." Miguel shook his head, smiling. "Well, that's more than most people ever say." Just then, another figure approached from the opposite side of the lot. Keanu walked toward them, carrying a pair of gloves and a hammer over his shoulder. His jeans were faded, his boots still marked with dust from the day before. He smiled as he reached them. "Looks like the team's getting bigger," Ethan chuckled. "Only if I don't destroy something first." Keanu handed him the hammer. "Then let's start here." Ethan turned the tool over in his hands, testing the weight. "It's heavier than I expected." Miguel smirked. "Everything feels heavier when you're not used to holding it." Keanu glanced between them with a quiet grin. "Good thing you've got the best teacher in the business." The three of them got to work. Miguel demonstrated how to line up the nails, explaining in simple, patient steps. Ethan listened carefully, his movements clumsy but earnest. Each missed strike brought laughter, and each successful one drew applause from nearby workers who had stopped to watch the unlikely trio. Soon the rhythm of work returned, the sound of hammers, the scrape of wood, the distant hum of drills. But now, it carried something more. The tension that had once divided them had turned into something solid, something that could hold weight. During a break, Ethan wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "You ever get used to this heat?" he asked, breathing hard. Miguel laughed. "No one does. You just stop complaining about it." Keanu smiled, leaning against a stack of lumber. "That might be the best life advice I've heard all week," Ethan grinned, glancing at both men. "Guess I've got a lot more to learn than I thought." Miguel nodded. "We all do. But it's a good start." The morning stretched into midday, and the once quiet site came alive with motion and laughter. The smell of sawdust mixed with coffee and the faint tang of sun-warmed metal. Ethan's shirt clung to his back, streaked with dirt and sweat, but he didn't seem to mind. For the first time in years, he wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was just trying to help. Miguel worked beside him, showing him how to brace the frame for a window. "Hold it steady," he said. "You want it level before you. Drive the nails in. It's all about balance." Ethan focused, brow furrowed, tongue pressed against his teeth as he lined up the beam. His first few tries were crooked, but Miguel was patient. "Try again," he said with a grin. "You're building, not decorating." Keanu chuckled from the other side of the room as he handed Ethan another nail. He's not wrong. They worked like that for hours, steady, methodical, with the rhythm of shared purpose. No one cared about titles or status. The sweat on their backs was the same. The dirt on their hands looked identical. When they stopped for lunch, Miguel opened his cooler and pulled out sandwiches wrapped in foil. He handed one to Keanu, then to Ethan. Ethan looked at the sandwich like it was something sacred. "You brought enough for everyone?" Miguel smiled. "It's what we do on site. You never eat alone." Ethan nodded, touched by the simple generosity. He sat down on an overturned bucket, taking a bite. "I can't remember the last time I earned a meal like this." Keanu looked at him. "Feels different when you build what you eat under, doesn't it?" Ethan smiled faintly. "It does." For a long while, they ate in companionable silence, the sounds of hammers and laughter filling the distance. Volunteers walked by, waving to Keanu and Miguel. A few even patted Ethan on the shoulder, treating him as one of their own. The world had quietly rearranged itself, if only within the boundaries of that work site. When the break ended, Miguel stood and stretched his arms. "Come on," he said. "We've got one more wall to finish before sundown." Ethan groaned playfully. "You're serious?" Miguel grinned. "Always." Keanu clapped him on the back. "Welcome to the real world, my friend." Together, they lifted the last frame into place. The wood groaned slightly as it rose, the sunlight hitting it just right, turning it gold. Miguel guided it with expert precision. Keanu braced it from one end, and Ethan drove in the final nail. When the hammer struck the last time, a cheer went up from the nearby workers. The frame stood perfectly aligned, solid and true. Miguel looked at it with pride, then turned to Ethan. "Not bad for your first house." Ethan laughed, out of breath. "It's not just a house," he said quietly. "It's a start." Keanu smiled, watching the wall stand firm under the clear blue sky. "That's all any of us can build," he said softly. "A good start." The three men stood side by side, the sunlight washing over them, the wind carrying the sound of their laughter across the open lot. For the first time, they weren't worker, actor, or sponsor. They were simply builders of homes, of understanding, of something lasting. The sun had started its slow descent by the time the final nail was hammered in. The golden light stretched long shadows across the site, bathing the row of completed homes in a warm, peaceful glow. The crew began to gather their tools, their tired bodies filled with quiet satisfaction. For most, it was another successful project completed. But for a few, especially Miguel, Ethan, and Keanu, it was something far more meaningful. Lydia arrived a short while later, her heels crunching softly against the gravel. She was dressed more casually now, her usual polished look replaced by jeans and a denim jacket. Her eyes shone as she looked around at the finished houses. "You did it," she said, smiling proudly at the team. "Every single one of you made this happen." Miguel wiped the sweat from his brow, leaning against the frame of the final house. "We did it together," he said humbly. Lydia nodded, then gave Keanu a subtle glance, one that carried the weight of a secret. Keanu gave her a small nod in return. The volunteers began to gather near the porch of the last house, chatting and laughing as the sun painted the sky in hues of pink and orange. Lydia stepped forward, raising her voice so everyone could hear. "Before we pack up," she said, "I have a little announcement." The crowd quieted, curious. Keanu stood a few steps behind her, his expression unreadable but calm. Ethan and Miguel stood side by side, both unaware of what was coming. Lydia smiled warmly, holding a small envelope in her hands. "Every build tells a story," she began. "And this last house carries a very special one. It's a story about dedication, humility, and what it really means to give. For 20 years, one man has built homes for others. He's given more than his time, he's given his heart." Miguel blinked, confused. A few of the volunteers began to turn toward him, smiling knowingly. Lydia continued, her voice trembling slightly. "So today, this final home is being dedicated to him and his family." Miguel froze. "What?" he whispered. Lydia's smile widened as she gestured toward the porch. "Miguel Santos, this house is yours." For a moment, no one breathed. Miguel's eyes widened as the words sank in. No, that's not. I can't." He shook his head, his hands trembling. "This isn't possible." Keanu stepped forward, his expression soft. "It's very possible," he said quietly. Miguel turned toward him, his lips quivering. "Keanu, "What did you do?" Keanu smiled faintly. "I just helped finish what you started." Lydia stepped closer, resting a hand on Miguel's arm. "Keanu covered the remaining costs of this build himself," she explained. "He wanted to make sure you had a place to call home." Miguel's breath caught. The weight of years of exhaustion, sacrifice, and quiet endurance came crashing down all at once. His knees buckled slightly, and Ethan stepped forward instinctively to steady him. Tears streamed down Miguel's face as he whispered, "I don't know what to say." Keanu shook his head gently. "You already said it," he replied softly. "Every day, through your work." The air seemed to shimmer with emotion as Miguel stood in front of the home he had helped build, now realizing it was his. The other workers surrounded him, their faces glowing with pride and affection. Some clapped quietly, others simply smiled through tears. It was the kind of silence that felt sacred, filled with awe rather than words. Miguel ran a rough hand along the newly painted wall, as if to make sure it was real. His voice wavered. "I've built so many houses, but I never thought I'd have one of my own. Not like this. Not something made with kindness." Keanu stepped beside him, his tone light but full of meaning. "Then it's about time one of those walls carried your story too." Ethan came forward, holding a small brass plaque wrapped in cloth. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing the words engraved in elegant letters. "The Santos Home." Beneath it read, "Built by many hands, led by one heart." Miguel covered his mouth, a soft sound escaping him. "You even named it?" Ethan smiled. "Every home deserves a name. This one was easy to choose." Lydia handed a small screwdriver to a young woman standing nearby, a bright-eyed college student with the same gentle eyes as Miguel. "This must be your daughter," Lydia said warmly. "Would you do us the honor?" Miguel turned, his breath catching. His daughter, Sophia, had arrived quietly moments earlier, escorted by a few volunteers who had reached out to her. She wore a borrowed work shirt and jeans, her dark hair pulled back, her eyes full of disbelief and pride. She walked slowly to her father's side, her hands shaking as Ethan held out the plaque. "Here," he said softly. "You should be the one to place it." Miguel placed his arm around her shoulders as she crouched to fasten the screws, her fingers trembling as she secured each one. When she finished, she stood and stepped back, tears running freely down her face. The sun caught the plaque at just the right angle, casting a golden shimmer across the words. Keanu clapped once, gently, then the rest of the volunteers joined in. The sound spread like a wave applause mixed with laughter, cheers, and a few cries of joy. Miguel wiped his eyes again, unable to contain his emotion. "I don't deserve this," he said quietly, turning toward Keanu and Ethan. "So many others need help. I was just doing my job." Keanu smiled. "You've done more than your job, Miguel. You've built homes and hope. That's what this was always meant to be about." Ethan nodded beside him. "And this isn't charity," he added softly. "It's gratitude." Miguel took a long, deep breath, looking at the house again. He seemed to stand taller now, no longer weighed down by years of exhaustion, but lifted by something larger, belonging, respect, love. Sophia hugged him tightly, whispering, "You finally have a home, Papa." Miguel closed his eyes, whispering back, "We have a home." The crowd erupted once more in applause as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of amber and rose. For a few timeless minutes, there were no titles, no wealth, no hierarchy, only people, bound by shared purpose and the walls they built together. And as the final light faded, Keanu placed a hand on Miguel's shoulder, smiling. "You've built hundreds of roofs," he said. "Now one finally rests above you." The celebration outside Miguel's new home lingered long after the sun had set. Volunteers gathered around the porch, holding cups of lemonade and sharing stories about the week's work. The laughter was light, the kind that came from honest exhaustion and joy. The smell of wood and fresh paint mixed with the evening air. Miguel sat on the steps, his arm around his daughter. She leaned her head on his shoulder, her eyes reflecting the porch light. For the first time in years, peace looked natural on his face. Nearby, Keanu spoke softly with Lydia, both of them watching the volunteers pack up for the night. But a few feet away, Ethan stood in quiet thought. His hands were in his pockets, his gaze fixed on the small crowd gathered around the house. He had never felt smaller or prouder. All the awards, the headlines, the polished events, none of them had ever filled him the way this dusty, uneven patch of earth did. He took a deep breath and turned toward Lydia. "Can I say something before everyone leaves?" She nodded, her expression soft. "Of course." Ethan stepped forward, clearing his throat. The crowd slowly fell silent. Even the sound of hammers in the distance stopped as the workers turned toward him. He looked nervous, but there was sincerity in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "I know most of you don't know me well," he began, his voice steady but quiet. "But some of you might remember how I acted a few days ago." He paused, taking in the faces watching him. "I said things I shouldn't have. I made jokes that came from arrogance, not humor. And I treated someone who's done more good for this world than I ever have, as if he was beneath me." Miguel shifted slightly, surprised, but said nothing. Ethan continued, his tone deepening. "Yesterday, I acted like money made me important. But today, I realized I've spent most of my life confusing value with wealth." The crowd stayed silent. Keanu watched him closely, his expression calm but approving. Ethan looked toward Miguel, his eyes softening. "This man," he said, "showed me what real worth is. He doesn't give because it looks good. He gives because it's who he is. Because his work doesn't just build walls, it builds people. And I was blind to that." Miguel's lips trembled slightly, emotion clouding his eyes. Ethan took a breath, then turned toward the workers standing around them. "You all deserve more than thanks. You deserve safety, recognition, and respect. So from today on, my company will be changing how we give. We'll still fund the materials and the projects, but we'll also invest where it really matters, into you." The workers exchanged curious looks. Ethan continued, his voice growing stronger. "Starting next month, we're launching a laborers' safety and skills program. Every builder, volunteer, and tradesman who works with our projects will get certified training and proper equipment. Because your skill and your dignity deserve investment too." For a moment, the crowd said nothing. The words hung in the warm evening air, settling deep into everyone's hearts. Then, slowly, one of the older builders began to clap. Another joined in, and soon, the entire group was applauding loudly, passionately, with the kind of appreciation that came from years of being unseen. Ethan looked around, his chest tightening with emotion. He hadn't expected the applause. He hadn't expected forgiveness. He was simply trying to make things right. Yet now, as he saw Miguel smiling and clapping among them, he realized something powerful. This wasn't about redemption. It was about joining something greater than himself. Miguel stepped forward through the crowd, stopping right in front of him. The two men looked at each other for a long moment, the noise fading around them. Miguel's voice was quiet but full of warmth. "You didn't have to do that," he said. Ethan smiled faintly. "I did. Because you did the hardest part. You taught me." Miguel's eyes glistened. "Then maybe we both built something today." Ethan nodded. "Yeah," he said softly. "We did." Keanu stepped closer then, resting a hand on Ethan's shoulder. His tone carried both pride and quiet authority. "You did something rare tonight. You listened, you learned, and you acted. That's what real leadership looks like." Ethan smiled, humbled. "I learned from the best," he said, glancing between Keanu and Miguel. Keanu chuckled lightly. "You learned from the right one," he said, gesturing toward Miguel. Miguel laughed, shaking his head. "Don't start that again." The crowd laughed with them, the tension that had once divided them replaced by genuine connection. Lydia wiped her eyes discreetly with the back of her hand, whispering to one of the volunteers, "This is the kind of ending every project should have." Keanu turned toward the workers and raised his voice just enough to carry. "You've all done something extraordinary," he said. "You didn't just build homes, you built a family. and families look out for each other. The workers cheered again, some raising their hard hats in the air. The sound rolled across the open lot like a wave. Ethan looked around at the faces illuminated by the last streaks of sunset, the faces of people who worked, laughed, and gave their strength to something bigger than themselves. "I want to promise you something," he said, raising his voice slightly. "This isn't the last time you'll see me out here. I'll be back with gloves and a hammer, not just a check." Miguel grinned. "Then we'll save you a spot." Ethan nodded. "Please do." Keanu smiled, watching the two men shake hands again. The same hands that had once symbolized two worlds now joined in shared purpose. He could see it clearly. The bridge they had built wasn't made of concrete or wood, but of humility, compassion, and respect. The sound of hammers and drills resumed softly in the distance as a few volunteers finished the last touches on the house. Keanu turned toward the horizon. The sky, glowing in streaks of crimson and gold. "That's what it's all about," he said quietly. "When one person learns to see another, everything changes." Ethan looked at him, the humility in his eyes unmistakable. "You were right, Keanu. Real success isn't about standing above anyone." Keanu nodded. "It's about standing beside them." The applause swelled again, echoing across the site as the three men stood together. Worker, sponsor, and star, all equals beneath the fading light. Weeks passed, and the memory of that evening at the construction site began to ripple far beyond the dusty field where it happened. What had started as one small housing project in a quiet California town was now becoming something much larger. It wasn't just about houses anymore. It was about people. Local newspapers were the first to notice. A headline on a small-town blog read, "Actor Keanu Reeves volunteers incognito on housing project transforms local charity culture." The story spread quickly. Larger outlets picked it up, adding photos of Keanu covered in dust, laughing beside workers in jeans and worn gloves. The image was powerful not because it showed fame, but because it showed humility. But when reporters reached out for interviews, Keanu declined every request. His response was simple: "The real story isn't me. It's Miguel and the people who build every day." The quote appeared in dozens of publications, but what stood out wasn't the actor's modesty. It was the honesty behind it. The narrative shifted. Suddenly, people began asking different questions. Who was Miguel Santos? What did his story represent? Why had a Hollywood star spent weeks working alongside him without cameras or fanfare? Soon, the charity's inbox was flooded. Volunteers wanted to join not because they hoped to meet Keanu, but because they wanted to be part of something meaningful. Retirees, college students, and families started showing up every weekend, ready to build. Donations increased, but so did something rarer: empathy. Lydia noticed it first. "It's strange," she told Keanu one afternoon as they walked through the site. "We used to have trouble finding consistent volunteers. Now, people are coming from 3 towns over, asking where they can help." Keanu smiled faintly, looking around at the busy scene. People just needed to remember what community feels like. At the other end of the lot, Ethan was stacking lumber beside a group of relevant high school students. He looked almost unrecognizable in his work gear, with paint on his sleeves and dirt under his nails. His company had begun quietly funding local community centers and youth training programs, but this time, his name wasn't on any banners. He didn't want recognition. He wanted change. Miguel, meanwhile, had settled into his new home with his daughter. Though he still worked on construction projects, there was something new in his posture, an ease that came from finally standing on solid ground, both literally and spiritually. Neighbors often saw him in the evenings sitting on his porch, watching the sunset with a cup of coffee in hand. One evening, Lydia stopped by with a thick envelope. "This came for you," she said. Miguel opened it slowly, frowning in curiosity. Inside was a letter from the local university, along with a small folded paper written in neat handwriting. He began to read, and his eyes softened almost instantly. It was from Sophia. Miguel unfolded the letter carefully, his calloused fingers trembling slightly as he began to read. The words were simple, but each one carried a weight only a daughter's heart could hold. "Dear Dad, By the time you read this, I'll have turned in my final thesis. It's dedicated to you, the man who built more than homes. You built hope, you built people, and you built me." Miguel paused, swallowing hard. The rest of the page blurred for a moment before his eyes refocused. "Every class I've taken, every project I've designed, every blueprint I've drawn was because you taught me that every wall tells a story. You showed me that greatness doesn't come from standing above others, but standing beside them. Thank you for being my first teacher and my forever example." Miguel lowered the letter, his eyes glistening. Lydia stood quietly nearby, her own eyes damp. "She's proud of you," she said softly. Miguel smiled through the dang tears. "I think, for once, I'm proud of me too." That evening, as twilight fell, the sound of laughter and hammering continued on the site nearby. New volunteers had taken up the work, building homes for other families. Keanu was there again, though he stayed away from the cameras that occasionally lingered by the fence. When a reporter approached and asked, "Why won't you talk about what you did here?" he simply smiled and said, "Because I didn't do it. They did." The next day, a local news channel aired a short segment titled "The Santos Effect." It showed clips of volunteers sharing how the story had changed them. One woman said she joined because she wanted her children to see what kindness looked like. A young man said he stopped chasing online fame and started showing up where people needed him. Ethan watched the segment from his office, but his office looked different now. No polished trophies or framed awards on the walls. Instead, photos of the crew, Miguel's family, and the finished homes filled the shelves. His assistant walked in, holding a stack of documents. "The new funding proposals for the Worker Training Initiative are ready," she said. Ethan smiled. "Approve them all," he replied. "Let's build something that lasts." Back at the construction site, Miguel and Keanu stood side by side, looking out at a new row of houses rising under the California Sunday. The air buzzed with the sound of saws and laughter. Young volunteers worked shoulder to shoulder with old ones, their faces bright with purpose. Keanu picked up a piece of lumber and set it in place. "You ever think your story would start something like this?" he asked. Miguel chuckled. "I didn't even know I had a story." Keanu smiled. "You didn't have to. You were living it." Miguel looked at the volunteers around them, the home standing strong against the light. "Then, maybe that's what we all should be doing," he said softly. "Building something that outlives us." Keanu nodded, his eyes following the horizon. "Looks like we already started." The hammering continued in rhythm, steady and strong, echoing across the valley like the heartbeat of a community reborn. The sky burned gold. As the sun dipped behind the hills, long shadows stretched across the finished row of houses, each one glowing softly under the final light of day. The scent of fresh lumber still lingered, mingling with the faint aroma of home-cooked food drifting from open windows. The site, once a field of dust and noise, now stood as a living testament to compassion, perseverance, and quiet change. Miguel's family sat on the porch of their new home, their laughter warm and steady. Sophia was telling a story from her classes, her hands moving animatedly as she spoke. Miguel leaned back in his chair, smiling with the contentment of a man who finally understood what peace felt like. The plates on the table were simple, but the moment was rich, the kind of moment that can only exist when years of struggle give way to gratitude. Keanu stood by his old pickup truck a few yards away, watching from a distance. He didn't want to interrupt. Some scenes, he believed, were too sacred to step into. They were meant to be witnessed, not owned. The sound of Sophia's laughter drifted toward him, and he smiled faintly. This was the ending he'd hoped for, not for himself, but for them. Ethan stood beside him, his hands in his pockets, looking out over the houses. "You think he believes it yet?" he asked softly. Keanu tilted his head slightly. "That he deserves it?" Ethan nodded. Keanu smiled. "Give him time. Some people build so much for others, they forget how to live inside what they've made." They stood in silence for a moment as the wind rustled through the unfinished lots nearby. A few volunteers were still tidying up tools, stacking wood, and rolling up extension cords. The worksite had quieted, but it hadn't gone. Still, it pulsed with life, like a heart that had found a new rhythm. Ethan looked toward the last house. "I never thought something this small could change me so much," he said. Keanu looked at him calmly. "That's the thing about change. It doesn't start with speeches or headlines. It starts with showing up." Ethan nodded, his gaze distant. "I guess it's like building, one nail at a time." Keanu chuckled softly. "Exactly." As the last bit of sunlight slipped below the horizon, Keanu opened the door of his pickup. The engine rumbled softly to life. He leaned out the window, giving one final wave toward the porch. Miguel looked up, grinning as he lifted his hand in return. Sophia waved beside him, her face lit by the porch light. Keanu smiled back, that quiet, knowing smile that said everything words couldn't. Then, with a gentle nod, he shifted into gear and pulled away from the sight. The dirt road caught the fading light as his truck disappeared into the amber glow of dusk. As Keanu's truck rolled down the quiet road, the hum of the engine faded into the evening stillness. The golden horizon gave way to the cool blues of twilight. Behind him, the row of houses stood like sentinels, symbols of what can happen when empathy replaces ego, when people choose to build bridges instead of walls. Inside his truck, the faint sound of the radio played an old country song about second chances. Keanu's hand rested on the steering wheel, his gaze calm and thoughtful. His clothes still carried traces of sawdust, and his boots were lined with dust, but he felt lighter than he had in years. The kind of lightness that comes from giving without needing anything back. His mind replayed the moments from the past week. The laughter, the lessons, the transformation he had seen not only in Ethan and Miguel, but in everyone who had stepped onto that worksite. He thought about how quickly people forget what really matters when life becomes too polished, too distant from the ground. As the road curved, the sunset reflected in his windshield. His voice echoed quietly in the cab, almost like he was speaking to himself, but really, to anyone who would listen. "We all build something," he said softly. "Every day, some of us build walls to protect ourselves, and some build bridges to reach others. The question is, what are we building with our hands, our words, our choices?" His voice lingered, steady and reflective, as the camera of the mind panned back toward the town. The homes glowed under the new street lights, casting a warm amber hue over the faces of people gathered outside. Children played in the yards. Volunteers shared stories on the porches they had helped raise. A once-forgotten community now pulsed with life and connection. The scene slowed, showing Miguel closing his front door for the night, pausing to glance once more at the plaque. The Santos home. He touched the brass letters gently before stepping inside, the light flickering warmly through the window as he joined his family for dinner. The hum of crickets filled the air. The wind moved softly through the new neighborhood, whispering across the rooftops. Then, Keanu's voice returned calm, reflective, filled with meaning. "We don't need grand gestures to make a difference. We just need to show up to lift a beam, to offer a hand, to listen. Kindness doesn't announce itself. It shows up, gets to work, and quietly leaves something better behind." The image of Keanu's truck disappeared down the road, the dust settling behind him. The final rays of the sun painted the horizon in gold one last time before fading completely into night. A moment of silence followed. Then the narrator's voice, steady, gentle, and direct, spoke to the audience. "Have you ever misjudged someone who turned out to be your greatest teacher?" The question lingered in the air, inviting reflection, humility, and understanding. Held still on the image of the finished homes, the lights glowing softly in the dark, symbols of redemption and unity. And just before the screen of the mind faded to black, Keanu's voice returned one final time, quiet and resolute. "We all build something, walls or bridges. The choice is ours." The music swelled softly, carrying warmth instead of triumph. It wasn't the sound of an ending, it was the sound of a legacy beginning.